Alexander Gray was a name known in every corner of the corporate world. His empire stretched across tech, real estate, fashion, and even art, though he had never held a paintbrush in his life. Living in a glass penthouse high above Manhattan, he watched the world below like a bored king in a crystal tower. His days were planned to the minute, surrounded by advisors who saw only numbers, never people. And though he was wrapped in luxury, there was a silence inside him no billions could fill. One quiet Sunday morning, avoiding traffic, his driver took an unfamiliar route through the Lower East Side. That was when he saw her, among vibrant chalk colors and unnoticed gazes, like a flame in a forgotten alley. A young woman knelt on the hot pavement, brushing life into stone as if it were her last breath. He didn't know it yet, but in that moment, his entire life began to unravel. Her name was Isla Reyes, and she painted not for fame, but survival. Every line she drew on the sidewalk came from a place of hunger, pain, and stubborn hope. Her world was a mess of unpaid rent, borrowed brushes, and nights beneath peeling ceilings. Yet in her art, there was a freedom that defied everything she lacked. Alexander couldn't look away. Her hands moved like music, her face absorbed in color and purpose. He asked the driver to stop, ignoring the man's confusion. Something in Isla's presence gripped him more tightly than any boardroom contract ever had. For the first time in years, Alexander stepped out of the car without a schedule, without a destination, drawn toward the pavement like a man lost in a dream. She didn't notice him at first. Her focus was on the swirls of orange blending with turquoise, forming a phoenix rising through cracked cement. She was used to people watching, sometimes judging, sometimes throwing coins without eye contact. But this man didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, still, expensive, and oddly silent. When she finally looked up, she blinked at the suit, the shoes, the aura of someone who did not belong there. "You're blocking my light," she said, without malice, only truth. And instead of offense, he smiled, his first real smile in weeks. "Sorry," he said, stepping back. "I didn't want to disturb the masterpiece." Isla arched an eyebrow, skeptical. "It'll be gone by morning," she muttered, wiping sweat from her brow. "Rain doesn't care about masterpieces." Alexander crouched beside her, suit creasing in a way his tailor would hate. "Then it's even more precious," he replied, surprising even himself. She laughed, just a short breath, but it was real. No one had called her work precious before. They called it graffiti, clutter, or noise. Yet this stranger in polished shoes saw something else, and it rattled her more than she wanted to admit. Over the next few days, Alexander returned, always in secret, always alone. He watched from a distance at first, trying to understand why her world felt more honest than his. Isla began to notice him lingering in corners, not speaking, just watching. One day she called him out. "You a cop? Or just some weirdo collecting starving artist stories?" He laughed and said, "Neither. I just like what you do." She shrugged and went back to painting, but she didn't ask him to leave. For some reason, she didn't want him to. They started talking, casually at first, then with more depth. He learned she once studied art in college, but had to drop out when her mother got sick. She never went back. Instead, she painted sidewalks to stay sane and alive. Isla learned that Alexander was the CEO of Greycore Industries, but had never painted anything besides corporate visions. "So, you're rich," she said one day bluntly. "And you're real," he replied. In a city of masks, it was a rare exchange of truth. Alexander found himself drawn to her world, not the struggle, but the rawness. In Isla's eyes, he saw something he hadn't felt in years, passion without profit. His board meetings began to feel more suffocating. His penthouse, once a symbol of success, felt cold and cavernous. He started sketching in secret, fumbling with pencils like a child rediscovering color. He hadn't told anyone, not his assistants, not his shareholders, that he'd missed 2 international calls just to sit by a cracked sidewalk. But to him, those hours were more valuable than any deal signed under glass and steel. One afternoon, Isla invited him to help with a mural on an old abandoned building. It was illegal, messy, and risky, and he agreed without hesitation. They painted side by side through the night, laughing under the stars, covered in color. For the first time, Alexander felt human, his hands dirty, his heart light. Isla looked at him differently now, with curiosity and something softer. She still didn't understand why a man like him kept showing up. But she didn't want him to stop. Gossip began to stir. A photo leaked of Alexander in paint-stained clothes. Tabloids spun rumors of a secret affair with his street artist lover. His board called emergency meetings. His father, who had built the foundation of the empire, was furious. "You're throwing everything away for a fantasy," he shouted. But Alexander didn't flinch. The empire never felt like his in the first place. Isla's world, chaotic and imperfect, was the only place where he felt alive. Then came the moment that tested it all. Isla was offered a commission, her first real chance at a gallery show. But it came with conditions. She had to distance herself from controversy, especially her connection to Alexander. They met on the rooftop of an old building, under a sky bruised with sunset. "They want me to choose," she said, voice low. Alexander looked at her, knowing what it meant. "Then let me make the choice for you," he said gently. "I'll step away." But Isla shook her head. "No. If I have to choose between my art and someone who finally believes in it, I choose both." The gallery offer became real, fast. Contracts, collectors, interviews, things Isla had only dreamed about. But with opportunity came pressure, and not just from the art world. Alexander's presence was now a target. Gossip outlets obsessed over the billionaire and the bohemian. Isla hated the spotlight, but she hated the idea of hiding more. "They want me polished," she said, wiping paint off her cheek before a meeting. "But I was never meant to be clean." Alexander held her hands and whispered, "Then they'll have to learn to love the dirt." At the same time, his empire was crumbling behind him. Investors panicked, shares dipped, and the board pushed for his resignation. Rumors swirled that he had lost his mind. His father called it a breakdown. His assistant called it a betrayal. But Alexander only called it waking up. He began stepping back from operations, selling off subsidiaries, pulling out of projects he once championed. "Why are you doing this?" Isla asked one night, curled beside him in her tiny apartment. "Because it was never mine," he replied. "Not the money, not the company, but you feel real." The gallery show opened on a rainy Thursday night. Isla stood by her largest canvas, a portrait of a faceless man in a gold suit, crumbling into dust. Critics praised her. Collectors whispered about raw power and political edge. But all she cared about was Alexander's eyes as he stared at the painting. He knew it was him, and he didn't mind. "Do you hate me in it?" he asked quietly. "No," she said. "I forgave you with every brushstroke." After the show, things accelerated. Offers came from Paris, Tokyo, Sao Paulo. Isla was invited to speak, to teach, to travel. But she hesitated. Leaving New York meant leaving the one place her art had roots. Alexander noticed her restlessness and offered a compromise. "Go. I'll wait." She looked at him, tired but glowing. "I don't want to chase dreams and leave you behind." He smiled. "Then take me with you. I've left bigger things behind." For 6 months, they traveled together, her exhibitions filling walls while he explored small villages with his sketchbook. He was no longer CEO. The name, Grey Core, still existed, but his name had vanished from the papers. He didn't miss it. Their days were filled with street food, train stations, and canvases laid out on hotel balconies. Alexander had never been so poor, relatively speaking, and never so rich in time, in feeling, in truth. But not everything was easy. Isla struggled with sudden fame. Crowds, critics, deadlines, it began to squeeze her. Her art became more guarded, less free. One night in Florence, she broke down crying in the middle of an unfinished mural. "They don't want my soul anymore. Just my brand." Alexander held her tightly, his shirt soaking her tears. "Then let's disappear," he said, "like we never existed." She looked at him, eyes red, and said, "Would you really give up everything for me?" And he whispered, "I already have." They retreated from the world again, renting a quiet cottage near the cliffs of Portugal. Days passed with waves crashing and paint drying slowly in the wind. There were no cameras, no press, no expectations. They woke when the sun rose. They kissed before the sky dimmed. And slowly, Isla rediscovered her voice. Not the loud one the world praised, but the quiet one she painted with as a child, beneath broken ceilings. One morning, Alexander found her painting a self-portrait on a wooden fence. It was raw and uneven, nothing like her gallery pieces. "It's not perfect," she said, brushing her hair from her face. Exactly, he replied, pulling her into an embrace. He had grown thinner, more relaxed, his hands now speckled with color. He didn't own an empire anymore, but he held the only masterpiece he'd ever wanted. A letter arrived from New York. His father had died, unexpectedly, quietly, and with it came a request to return, even briefly, to handle affairs. Isla squeezed his hand when he read it. "You don't have to go," she said. But Alexander knew he would, just once, to close the door for good. "Come with me," he asked. "Only if we don't stay," she replied. And he nodded. One more goodbye, and nothing more. Back in Manhattan, everything felt colder. The penthouse was still his, untouched, like a museum of a man who never truly lived. Isla stood at the window, staring at the city's roar below. Alexander burned the last of his suits, piece by piece, in the fireplace. They scattered his father's ashes in the Hudson. And when the board offered to reinstate him, he simply said, "I'm not lost. I've just found something better." Then he took Isla's hand and walked away again, this time forever. After closing the final chapter in Manhattan, Alexander and Isla returned to Portugal. The sea greeted them like an old friend, crashing against the cliffs with the same wild rhythm. Their lives slowed again, not because they had to, but because they chose to. They planted herbs, built shelves with their own hands, and painted on whatever surfaces they could find. Isla's art became more personal, more chaotic, more alive. Alexander started sculpting from driftwood, clumsy at first, but deeply moved by the process. Neither cared if the world saw it. They were no longer creating for applause, but for each other. One afternoon, Isla painted Alexander's back while he napped outside, warm sun soaking his skin. When he woke, there were blue wings stretched across his shoulders. "You're my escape," she whispered, watching the paint dry against his muscles. He smiled, pressing his forehead to hers. "And you're the reason I never want to escape again." In that moment, nothing else existed. Not galleries, not headlines, not lost fortunes or family names. Just brushstrokes and breath. Just two people, finally whole. They were invited to art festivals, interviewed by magazines, celebrated as the couple who walked away. But most offers they politely declined. Isla feared that fame would again steal her voice. Alexander feared it would steal her from him. They chose instead to open a small community studio in a coastal town nearby, free for children, free for anyone who had something to say, but no one to listen. Word spread slowly. They didn't want crowds, just connections. Children came with broken crayons and wide eyes. Elderly women arrived with stories woven into cloth. Fishermen brought in scraps of rope, and Alexander taught them how to shape boats with hands instead of nets. Isla watched it all, amazed that something so quiet could feel so grand. She kissed Alexander behind the easels, still tasting salt and oil paint. He laughed against her lips and whispered, "This is the only legacy I care about." And she knew he meant it. One evening, during a storm, the studio roof began to leak. They worked side by side to patch it, slipping in puddles, covered in mud. It reminded them both of how far they'd come. "Remember when you wore $1,000 shoes and never touched paint?" Isla teased. "And you wore armor made of sarcasm," he shot back. They laughed under the thunder, holding each other as rain poured through the cracks. Even soaked, even shivering, they were warmer than they'd ever been. The village grew to love them, not as celebrities, but as neighbors. Isla painted murals on stone fences and taught teenagers how to channel rage into color. Alexander built benches and took quiet walks with old men who barely spoke. They were not rich, but they had wine, fresh bread, sunrise, and each other. And in every corner of their small rented home, there was proof of their happiness. Paint on the doorknobs, sketches in the bathroom, laughter echoing through the kitchen. On their third anniversary together, Isla surprised Alexander with a new mural. It was of him, sitting on a cracked sidewalk, watching a faceless woman paint in flames. But this time, his face was full of color, not glass. "That was the moment you became real," she said. He traced the brush lines with trembling fingers. "That was the moment I found my way home," he replied. They kissed in front of the mural, surrounded by the townspeople who clapped and cheered like family. News of the disappeared billionaire turned community artist still popped up online from time to time. But Alexander never looked. He had no social media, no email, no assistant. The only reminders of his past were the letters that sometimes arrived from former colleagues, most unopened. Isla asked him once if he ever missed it. "I miss nothing," he said simply, "because everything I never knew I needed is right here." Isla painted until her fingers ached. Alexander built until the wood splintered in his hands. They grew older together with joy and grace. Wrinkles arrived like permanent laugh lines, and gray hairs curled near their temples. Some days were silent, some were loud, but none were empty. Each night, they fell asleep tangled in the scent of salt and turpentine, dreaming of colors that didn't yet exist. And when tourists asked their story, Isla would smile and say, "He left his empire behind." Alexander would add, "For a woman who painted on the sidewalk." But what they never explained, what no one could ever fully understand, was that the real masterpiece wasn't on a canvas. It was the life they built with bare hands, honest hearts, and a love too stubborn to sell.